This video is all about combining particles with dynamic objects. In other words, we can make particles influence dynamically interacting items and vice versa. Or, to put it more simply, it's all about explosions and destruction. Before I embark on the main project, I'll show you some simple examples of what I mean. First, let's look at the dynamic collider. This lives here in the particle section. In this scene, I have a cube, a ground plane, and a particle system comprising a single emitter, in this case a surface emitter, and connected to the emitter is the plane. So when we run the simulation, the plane will emit particles. I've limited the lifetime of the particles to 20 frames. As you can see, the particles pass straight through the cube as if it's not there. They could as well be neutrinos passing through a planet. So first we need to add some dynamics to this scene. If we go into the dynamics section and make the plane into a static rigid body, that means it's not going anywhere, but it will interact with other dynamic items. We want the cube to move, so let's make that into an active rigid body. And if I double click on here, we can bring up the solver, which has been automatically added for us. I'll put it over here by the particle simulation. I'm going to adjust the gravity because I know that this simulation works better with a very low gravity value. So if we now run the simulation, we expect for some dynamics to happen. And they do. The cube falls to the ground. Okay, so far so good. The particles are still ignoring the cube, and this is where the dynamic collider comes into play. Let's add one in and see if that makes any difference. There you can see that the dynamic collider is acting as a bridge between the dynamic solver and the particle simulation. So data will be passing between these elements, and they can then be coordinated to create the effect of particles interacting with the dynamic objects. Let's run the simulation again. And you can see that the particles are now striking the object and causing it to move. Amazing. The dynamic collider is very useful if the particles represent very small objects like dust or sand, or are used to represent gases and liquids. We can consider these particles as points in space, which do not interact with one another. But what if the particles are attached to large bits of geometry via a replicator? In this case, we would expect the particles to collide with one another and with other objects in the scene according to the shape of the objects. Enter stage right, the dynamic replicator. In this model, the particle system consists of a single radial emitter, and a replicator is used to create a rock centered on each particle. And if we cache the simulation, then we can also render it. As you can see from the preview render, there is a rock associated with each particle in the particle system. Whilst I'm thinking about it, let me just suppress the prototype rock, and then we won't have to look at that anymore. So far so good, but these particles are not interacting with the environment. So let's just try adding a dynamic collider. Remember, the dynamic collider will make the particles interact with dynamic objects in the scene. In this case, we just have the plane. Let's cache the simulation. And if we scrub through the timeline, you'll notice that the particles are indeed interacting with the plane, but they're not interacting with one another. Moreover, when they collide with the plane, it's the particles that collide, not the volumes of the rocks. And if we look at the preview, we'll see that all the rocks are overlapping one another. and sticking out underneath the plane. So in this case, the dynamic collider is not the right thing to use. We should instead be using dynamic replicators. Adding a dynamic replicator is actually very straightforward. If we select the replicator, then go into the dynamics section and make it into an active rigid body, then Modo will do all the magic for us. It creates a dynamic replicator item, connects it to the prototype, the rock, and also to the solver and the particle system so that they can communicate with one another. Now when we run the simulation, particles should interact with one another and with the dynamic objects in the scene. As I said, in this case, just the plane. Shall we cache that simulation and have a look at the render? Then we can see that the rocks are piled one on top of one another and they don't stick out underneath the plane. Now you could add in a dynamic replicator manually by creating the item and then connecting it to the solver, to the particle simulation and to the prototypes, but given that Modo will do it all automatically for you, why bother? One last thing that we can adjust is the collision shape associated with the dynamic replicator. At the moment it's set to hull. That means that we'll take a convex hull around the objects and use that as the collision shape. This is going to be quite efficient but won't be the most accurate. A multi-hull might provide slightly more accurate results, although I suspect in this case it'll be difficult to see any difference. If we use a mesh, then the collision shape will be based on the mesh of the rocks, and because the rocks have a very complicated mesh, this will be extremely expensive. I would only recommend using a mesh for relatively simple shapes. After many adventures, we have finally reached the obsidian labyrinth. Before us lies an impenetrable gate of eldritch crystal. Fortunately, we noticed a handily placed rock pile and resolved to use our trusty +3 dynamite of destruction. So, what's the plan for realizing this in Modo? We can create a pile of rocks using a dynamic replicator, as we already saw. Next, we need to explode it. We can use a momentary radial force for that. The final step is the most exciting. We can use the procedural shatter item to break the eldritch gate and gain access to the labyrinth. Fame and fortune await. But before we get too excited, first let's create our prototype rock. Now we could create a rock by sculpting, but there is an alternative. There's a procedural item dedicated to building rocks. If I add that into the scene and zoom in, you can see this is the initial prototype for the rock. It's a bit boring, looks more like a pebble at the moment, so we need to do something to make it look a bit more exciting. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an item mask for the rock so that I can put some shading onto it. What I've found is quite an effective way of seeing the form of the rock is to use a matte cap shader. So let's add one of those in. It's a special item, and we need to apply one of the matte cap materials for the shader. I've already imported one of them into the clip bin. You'll find all of the matte cap materials in the content browser. So there we've got a nice view of the rock. To increase the detail on the rock, we need to edit its properties. Let's bring up the rock displacement properties, and these are the things that we need to look at. the rock has 3 levels of displacement, and these effectively add features to the rock at different scales and different amplitudes. So for each of these displacements we can choose the noise type, the fractal amplitude, that's how big the noise is going to be, the scale, that, as you might imagine, is the size of the noise, and we can also use this curve here to affect the shape of the noise as it's applied. So let's turn on the first level of displacement. This is just going to be our crude basic shaping of the rock. That looks, well, looks like a potato now, but we can fiddle around with this here to see if we can create some different shaping. It's a matter of trial and error to a certain extent. There, that doesn't look so bad as a basic shape for a rock. And now I'll add another displacement layer, but this time I'm going to use the cellular noise. And this helps to create some sort of eaten away effects. If you go crazy, you can create some impossible shapes which don't look anything like a rock at all, just look like a mess of geometry. That's looking a bit more random and rocky, and I'm going to add another cellular layer, this time at a very small scale, but with a very low amplitude, which will just carve in some extra detail. So there we have a rather gnarled and twisted rock. So let's go with that. Now we're going to use this rock in our main scene in a dynamic replicator, but unfortunately we can't use a procedural item as the input to the dynamic replicator. So we're going to have to convert this into a real piece of geometry. And the one way to do that is to go into the geometry menu and bake the geometry cache. We're only interested in the surfaces. And what this has done is create a group containing all of the geometry baked down, in this case just one item, which is our rock. So if I hide the procedural rock, we've now got the baked geometry, and we can copy this into our main scene. If I turn it into a subdivision surface, it smooths it out nicely. Let's pile some rocks. First I'll move the rock that we prepared earlier into the main scene. There we go. And let's rename it something more sensible. Call it mesh rock to be imaginative. And now we need to create a particle system with a dynamic replicator so that we can squirt rocks onto the ground to make a big pile. So step one, let's create an emitter. It doesn't really matter what sort, but let's stick with a radial emitter. I will adjust the cone angle down to something quite small so that all the rocks are heading in the same direction, and we want it pointing down, not up. Let's move it up some way so that there's some room for the rocks to fall down. That's probably good enough. And we also need to adjust the emission rate. Let's have it fairly low. Let's have 2, and we don't want random velocities, we just want a fixed velocity. Okay, let's add those things into our schematic so that we can see what's going on. Then we have a particle system connected to our radial emitter. Let's make the particles visible on the video and simulate. There we have a stream of rocks falling to the ground. There at the moment they're random. Let's change that to uniform so that we get a... We don't want the rocks too close together, otherwise they'll collide with one another before they get anywhere, and that could cause all sorts of havoc. Right, that's looking reasonable. The next step is to create a replicator. So add particles replicator, and the particles will come from the particle system, and the prototype will be our rock. So let's drag the rock into the schematic and plug it into the replicator. Now when we run the simulation, we should get a rock per particle. But this is just an ordinary replicator, not a dynamic replicator. So let's make that dynamic. We go into Dynamics, make it into an active rigid body, and here we have the dynamic replicator added into our system, which requires a little bit of reorganization to see what's going on. And this is connected to the dynamic solver. Job done. Now if we run the simulation, the rocks should fall to the ground and then bounce around. Oh, but they don't. What have I done wrong? The ground's not a dynamic object. So let's select the ground and make it into a static rigid body. And now it's connected to the solver. Well, let's run the simulation again. There, we're making a decent pile of rocks. I can probably afford to up the emission rate. Let's have it at 3, and I think I'll move the emitter up a bit further, just to give a bit of room for the rocks to settle out. So I don't know how many rocks we want. If we cache the simulation, let's have a look at frame 240 and see how good a pile of rocks we've got there. I mean, that's probably good enough. Maybe if we increase the emission rate just a little bit more. Cache again. That's probably plenty. So at some point we're going to have to stop emitting particles because we don't want to have a bunch of particles flying in the air when we make the explosion. We want a nice settled pile. So let's pick an arbitrary time. Let's say at time 180 we're going to turn off the emissions, and then that should give time for the rock pile to sort of settle out before we destroy it. Okay, so time 0, let's set a key emission rate 4, and then at time 180 we'll set another key and change the emission rate to 0 because we don't want any more particles. If we bring up the graph editor and look at the emission rate, you can see it's gradually tailing off. If that's not quite what we want, if we want it to be constant and then go down, we can change the curve type to be stepped, in which case we get constant and then boom, down to 0. That's fair enough. Either will work. So now when we cache the simulation and then slide forward to time 240, we have a pile of rocks, but none floating in the air. We can change the dynamic characteristics of this rock pile creation process by adjusting some of the properties of these objects. If we want them to be a bit more sticky, for example, we could increase the friction and reduce the bounce. Cache again and see, we should get a slightly more bunched result. Oh, I think that'll do. We're not looking for perfection, it's just a pile of rocks after all. Before I go any further, just a little bit of tidying. I'm going to hide the rock prototype so that doesn't appear in any of the renders, and I'm going to create a workspace to store this particle system in. I'll call it work rock pile, I think. And let's move all these things into there. So select everything and then move nodes to workspace rock pile. And finally, let's bunch these together into a group and call that group rock pile. There, everything's tidy again. So, we have a pile of rocks. Now we need to make them explode. I'll extend the timeline. Let's make it twice as long. And then we'll start at 240 and go to 480. And that way we're looking at the time after we've prepared the pile of rocks. And this is the time at which we want to create the explosion. So I think the next step is to create a new workspace, and I'll call this work explode for reasons that should be patently obvious. Let's select that workspace. Now, to make the explosion, we want to apply a force to these particles. An explosion is essentially a violent expansion of gases, which causes everything else to expand out. So what we want to use here is a radial force. So let's add in the radial force. So we are in the middle of our pile of rocks, ready to blow it apart. Add it into the workspace. We'll bring in some of the elements that we need for this. There we are, it's been added into our scene for us. Now we don't want this radial force to happen straight away. We want it to happen at the beginning of this time slice. So at 240 would be a good time to suddenly apply this force. So at time 0 we really want for the force to be 0. So we'll set its strength to 0 and then scroll forward to time 240, and at that point we want to set the strength. Well, we're going to have to experiment to see what an appropriate strength is. Let's set it to 100% for now. Let's bring up the graph editor. And again, we don't really want the strength to gradually ramp up. We want it to happen suddenly and violently. So we'll change this curve to be stepped rather than smooth. Now, an explosion is really a momentary thing. It doesn't continue applying the force after the explosion has happened. So we'll set another key just a few frames on and bring the force back down to 0, I think. Okay, so I think we're now at a position where we can maybe give it a trial run. Let's cache the simulation. Now we need to extend to 480. Cache the simulation. There we go. And here we are at frame 240 with our rock pile prepared. And then the force is being applied and nothing is happening. So I think we need a bit of a stronger force. Ah, that's interesting. They seem to be going into the middle. And that's because the radial force is pulling in rather than pushing apart. We have an implosion. Let's change the sense of the force to be inverted. Okay, now it's going to work. Look at that. There, I think we have a fairly satisfactory explosion now. I think what I'll do is move the radial force somewhat to the left to give more of an impetus to the particles towards the Eldritch portal. We can come back and fiddle around with it later on. Right, what's next? Well, another property of an explosion is that it is very localized, and at the moment we have a radial force that essentially fills the whole of space. We would expect the particles and the inside of the rock pile to get more force applied to them and less as we go further away from the center of the explosion. And the ideal tool for having an explosion tail off is a fall off. And there is several different sorts of fall offs, the radial, linear and capsule. I think what we need is a radial fall off. And as you can see, it's automatically connected it to our radial force. And just to make sure that it's in the right place, let's go into the item list. And if I parent the two together, clear out the offset, then wherever I move the radial force, the fall off should follow. It's a little bit cluttered there. If I were to hide the particle simulation and the replicator, then you can see it a bit better. There we go. Is that fall off big enough? No, I suspect it's probably not. So let's make the fall off a bit bigger. And now our explosion is localized to within this region here, so any particles over here won't get affected. Let's give that a go. Turn everything back on again. Okay, so the fall off is obviously working, but let's increase the solid core so that most of the particles will get affected by it. And I think I'll make it a bit bigger still. There we go. We have explosion. Bang. Yes, I think I'm reasonably happy with that. Okay, let's bring up a render just to see what our scene is looking like in its full gory detail. So the rocks we haven't given a material to yet. So let's do that now before we get any further. If I apply a material to the rocks, and I'm going to use this material I prepared earlier called matte rock. And now the rocks don't look quite so dull and boring as they used to. You'll notice that the rocks are not all exactly the same. We've got some colour variation going on here. I'll just quickly show you the material so you can see how that's done. So basically the rocks have a granite material which is controlling the diffuse colour and the bump. To be honest, at this distance you probably won't see much effect from the bump, but when we do some closer in shots then it may be worth having there. You can see some effect of the bump there, I think. And then to imbue these objects with slightly different colors and brightnesses, we're using this variation texture and injecting some variation on the diffuse amount, so that controls the basic reflectivity of the diffuse on them, and also some variation on the color as well. So that effectively breaks things up a bit so that we don't see all the rocks looking like clones of one another. It also disguises the fact to a certain extent that every single one of these rocks is identical to the others. If you're really concerned about that, you can generate yourselves a whole bag of different rocks, and then you can feed those into the replicators, and it will randomly choose from that pool of rocks. A pool of rocks doesn't sound quite right. Right, so the next step is to shatter this eldritch portal. And now the bit that everyone's been waiting for, the bit where we get to break stuff. So what we would like is for these exploding rocks to smash through this outer gate and give us access to the labyrinth. First thing we need to do is make sure that all of these walls and columns are actually dynamic items, and we want them to be static rigid bodies because we don't want them to go anywhere. We want the rocks to bounce off them and the shards of this gate to smash up and bounce off. So let's make sure that all of this geometry is dynamic geometry. I can select it because I've cunningly put it all into one group. So if I double click the group, all of my labyrinth geometry is selected, and then I can make it into static rigid bodies. Okay, with that job out of the way, let's arrange for this item to be shattered. And the way that we do that is we select the outer gate item. Now it's important that the outer gate item not be a dynamic item itself. If we just check down here, we can see that there's no dynamic entry. If we were to make this into a dynamic item, it would potentially interfere with itself, if you'll pardon the expression. So that said, let's now make this into a shatterable item by using the procedural shatter, and we can add that into our schematic workspace, and it's been automatically connected to the solver and to the prototype object from which the procedural object is going to be derived. Now that we've done that, we don't need the original object to be visible, so we can hide it. But don't panic. What we need to do is to run a simulation, and then the procedural shatter item will inherit the geometry of the outer gate item, and we'll see it in our results. So let's run the simulation for the full time. That's 0 to 480. And let's scrub through the timeline and see how well that's worked. We're really only interested in frames after 240 because that's where all the exploding and shattering action takes place. Well, okay, that's slightly underwhelming. The object has shattered, but it's not quite the spectacular shatter that we were hoping for. But the procedural shatter has a number of different settings that you can adjust in order to determine how many shards are generated and what shape the shattering is. The one that I've plumped for is the uniform shatter option. So let's rerun the simulation with the new option selected and see if we get a better result. When it pauses in the middle, it's a good sign. It means that lots of items have been generated. And let's scrub through the timeline and see how that looks. Well, there's lots of shards now. I think that's more along the lines of what I had in mind. So while we're here, we might as well fiddle with some of the settings. We could reduce the number of shards generated by adjusting this pieces per cubic meter setting, change that to 30, say, and rerun the simulation. Now we should get far fewer shards generated, and with any luck the simulation will run a lot quicker. And again, scrub through the timeline. So we've got fewer but bigger shards generated from our collision. Well, let's stick with that and see what that looks like in the render. So F8. So that's looking pretty cool. But you'll notice that the edges of these shards are white rather than the same color as the material of the Eldritch gate. And the reason for that is this setting here, the interior material name. The procedural shatter item lets us put a custom material on the edges of the shards. In this case, we don't really want a custom material. What we want is to use the same material as for the front and back of the shards. So if we have a look in our shading tree and identify which material is being used, it's matte pane, which is the material for the panes, naturally. So let's change this interior material name to matte pane, rerun the simulation, and when it comes back we should find that the edges are now the same material as the front and back of the shards. And that seems to be what's happening, which is a big relief. So that's that simple. You may need to fiddle around with some of the settings in here to get exactly the density of shards and the breakability of the sheet correct. There are things that can go wrong, such as leaving the prototype object still in the scene and having it as a dynamic item. That leads to all sorts of strange things happening. Or you might find that the rocks roll into the barrier before you're ready for the explosion and shatter it too soon. There are various things you might do to stop that from happening. You could put a temporary barrier in the way to stop them from doing that, or just fiddle around until they don't do it. So after all this build-up, in fact the procedural shatter was one of the simpler things to set up. Okay, so that just about rounds off this project, but before I go I'd like to show you a couple of extra techniques which you might like to use to enhance the visual appeal of this scene. So the first one is emit on collision, and what this enables us to do is have objects emit particles when they collide with other objects. One use might, for example, be to create a dust cloud. So let's see how we can create emit on collision. The first thing to do is to select the objects that we want to be involved in the collision. So I've handily created all of my geometry in this group called geometry. We don't want all of these objects, but everything in the labyrinth I think should be involved in collisions, so we can double click that to select all of that geometry. There we go. If we're really fussy we can go in here and deselect the groups, but it doesn't really matter. And now we have access to the emit on collision function, which is here in the dynamics section. Note if this is grayed out, that means that you haven't selected more than one dynamic object. So if we can now create the emit on collision object, and we'll find it added at the bottom here. We can add it into the scene. And you'll see that it's driven by this group here. What Modo has done is it's created a group, and in this group are all of the objects that we selected when we created the emit on collision object. What we would like in this scene also is for the shards from the procedural shatter to be involved in the emit on collision. Now we couldn't add those directly, but what we can do is select the group, select the procedural shatter object, and then add the item into the group. So now all of the shards from the shatter will also be included in the emit on collision. Now this can generate quite a lot of particles, so I think I will reduce the emission rate to maybe 10. And then there's a subtle issue with this scene now, in that if I click on here, you'll see that it's actually connected to our original particle simulation. We don't really want that. What we want is for these particles to live in their own separate particle simulation. So we'll disconnect that and then remove those from the schematic. And while I think of it, why don't we add these objects into a new workspace? And we can call this work. Well, I'll call it dust. And now select these objects and move them into that new workspace. Move nodes to work dust. There we go, much better. This group has got a silly name, so let's rename it to, I don't know, colliders or something so that we know what it's doing. Right, so okay, so the problem now is that this collision emitter doesn't have a particle system associated with it. So let's create that. Particles simulation. Particle simulation. There we go. And we can take the particles emitted from this collision into this particle simulation. Let's make these things a bit more visible. And we should be ready to fly. So let's cache this simulation. And let's have a look and see what's happened. So, bang. Oh, look, all of that blue is the results of collisions. Cool. Well, so you'd probably want to finesse this a little bit, perhaps change the lifetime of the particles so they're fairly fleeting. There. And then finally you'll want to attach something to these particles, such as a small piece of geometry or maybe a volume or a sprite, in order to give them something to look at in the render. Without that, then they don't show up at all. But what you choose is entirely up to you. Well, there's one rather irritating feature of this scene, and that is that if we want to go back to the beginning of our animation, for example, we can see the rock pile being created. And we don't really want that. We want for the rock pile to be there permanently from the beginning of time. And this is going to require some feat of time travel. So what we need to do is go to the point at which the rock pile is complete. In this case it's frame 240, and take a copy of the rock pile. And we can do that by selecting the particle simulation, and then going up into the dynamics menu and then convert particle cache particles to cloud. And that will create a point cloud in our item list. The point cloud is just a collection of vertices effectively. So let's drag the point cloud into our schematic and create ourselves another replicator. I think you can see where I'm going with this. If we feed the point cloud into the replicator and give it the same prototype, in this case our trusty rock, then we will now have a frozen version of our rock pile. If I suppress this replicator, then we still have a rock pile. If I scrub through the timeline, I think you can see what's going on. We have the baked version of the rock pile permanently in place, and then we have the dynamic version that takes over at frame 240. And in order to make this work, what we will need to do is turn on and off the visibility of the two versions of the rock pile. So let's do that. Let's go back to frame 0, and at frame 0 we would like for the static version of the rock pile to be enabled. So let's put a key in there and set it to yes. But the dynamic version will be turned off at this point. So let's set a key and set it to no. And now let's scroll forward in time to frame 240 and change things over. So the dynamic version of the replicator will be enabled, and the static version will be turned off. And now as we scrub through the timeline through frame 240, we only ever have one version of the rock pile. So, armed with these tools, you should be able to create dynamic systems in which particles interact with objects in the scene, and you'll be able to smash objects and blow things up, and I look forward to the results of your experiments. Thanks for watching.